All right, let's talk about some hormones. Many organs in the body secrete uh, molecules that act as carriers of information, the signaling molecules. We may occasionally mention some of those hormones when we talk about that particular organ. Usually, the organ has some other, much more important function, and secreting a hormone is kind of a sideshow. So, we'll mention renin when we talk about a kidney. There's ACE in the lungs. There's some other things in the lungs. Skin secretes its own hormones. Vitamin D, made in the skin, is also considered to be a hormone. Bones have their own hormones. Heart, natriuretic factor, that's a hormone. So a lot of uh, organs in our body secrete hormones as one of their kind of less important functions to do something much more important, but they also secrete a hormone here and there. In this part of our course, when we talk about the endocrine system, we are talking about hormones that are primarily that are secreted from organs that are primarily or entirely devoted to the function of synthesizing, making, and secreting that hormone, and little else. Or something that is like half and half, like pancreas has an exocrine and endocrine function. Here we talk about its endocrine function. Once we get to the digestive system, we'll talk about its exocrine function. Those two are kind of independent from each other and separate, so we talk about pancreas twice. So when we talk about the endocrine system in its kind of narrower sense, the organs that are devoted to the making of hormones, the most important such organ is the brain. Yes, it's nervous system, but it secretes a bunch of hormones that control other hormones. And most of those hormones are synthesized and secreted in the hypothalamus, which is on the bottom of the brain, and those are releasing and inhibiting factors. Releasing and inhibiting factors uh, are made in various types of cells in the hypothalamus, and then they enter capillaries there. There's a capillary bed in the hypothalamus, which then fuses into tiny little vein, which goes into the anterior pituitary and then spreads into another capillary bed. You may be familiar with the word portal circulation. Every time you have a capillary bed and another capillary bed, and there's a single vessel in between them, that's portal circulation. Usually, you have an artery, you know, blood coming from the heart, and then opens into a capillary bed, does its job there, fuses into a vein, which goes back to the heart. But in several places in the body, you'll have another large or singular vessel connecting two capillaries beds. This is one of them. Hypothalamo hypophyseal circulation is a portal circulation. So all of those stimulatory or releasing factors and inhibiting factors from the hypothalamus go into the anterior pituitary, where they either stimulate or inhibit sti- uh, s- uh, s- synthesis and release of various other hormones. Anterior pituitary secretes a number of hormones. Growth hormone, prolactin, LH and FSH, TSH. So your book has a lot of detail about them, and I've written some more in my handout. But let's just go very briefly through some of those. Growth hormone is a very large protein that is secreted the uh, from the anterior pituitary under either stimulation or inhibition from the factors from the hypothalamus. When secreted in the bloodstream, it goes everywhere in the body, and every cell in the body is supposed to at least have receptors for growth hormone. It's going to be a membrane receptor because it's an enormous protein. What it does is it instructs that cell to synthesize and secrete uh, insulin-like growth factors. Those insulin-like growth factors are secreted by the cell into its immediate intercellular environment, where it can attach to the membrane receptor, surface receptor of that same cell, which is autocrine regulation. That signal now is going to tell the cell to divide. When you divide one cell into two, and the neighboring cell did the same thing, one to two, and one to two, and one to two, suddenly you have double the number of cells in that organ or in the tissue in the whole body. That is growth. Prolactin is a much smaller protein. Actually, some call it a large peptide. It's a very, very large peptide or a small protein. The distinction is more because it doesn't have much of a complexity. It's a very, very long chain of amino acids, but it doesn't have a lot of tertiary quaternary structure as far as multiple units and all sorts of stuff bound to it. It's just a relatively simple but very long peptide. Uh, Prolactin has a lot of functions in our body, and if you look across the vertebrates, mammals, birds, and all that stuff, it is probably a hormone that has most different functions of all the hormones we know, and it does a lot of things. Um, so in humans, the most important function of the prolactin is to stimulate the synthesis of milk. We talked about oxytocin before. Oxytocin has to work with the milk that's already there and just eject it out. It is the prolactin that instructs the mammary glands to actually make the milk and store it there in the first place. Uh, and it has things to do with energetics, but in a different way from a lot of other hormones. It is mostly about fat deposition. So, grabbing the energy from other types of molecules, from food and whatnot, transforming it into fat and depositing it into adipocytes all over the body, which means, long term energy storage. Um, this can actually be used in agriculture. So, growth hormone is going to build up muscle, right? You tell the body to divide all the cells, muscle cells are going to divide, and you get twice as much muscle. While prolactin is going to take all of that energy from the food and transform it into fat. Different types of food can trigger different hormones. So, for example, when you have pork production, you are going to feed that uh, you're going to feed the piglets. You're going to feed the piglets ground corn for a while, for several months. So what is that going to do? This corn is pretty fatty, and there's plenty of it, and the body's getting too much energy, and that's going to trigger prolactin. So while the piglets are eating uh, corn, they're going to mostly deposit fat, including under the skin. And then you switch the food to slop. Slop has a lot of protein and not that much fat, and it's going to inhibit prolactin and stimulate growth hormone. So now the little piglets are not depositing fat, they're growing muscle. You swap it again to corn, again to slop, again to corn, again to slop, and after a couple of years, you have a wonderfully layered marble bacon. It doesn't work like that in humans, but this example is going to make you remember forever that growth hormone builds the body, including the muscle, while prolactin lays down fat. Okay, other hormones in the interior are, for instance, TSH, which stimulates the thyroid gland to secrete its hormones, thyroxine and 3-iodothyronine. Um, and LH and FSH. LH and FSH are uh, something that we go into much more detail in the reproductive system, which you're already studying by now, I hope. So we are going to give them a pretty short thrift right now. So that is adenohypophyses uh, or anterior pituitary. Um, there is a thin layer between the anterior and posterior pituitary, which is called pars intermedia, and it looks a little bit different under the microscope. It has only one type of cells, and they secrete MSH. MSH is a melanin stimulating hormone. So when it is stimulated, it goes into the bloodstream and um, and stimulates the increase of production of melanin in the skin. So you can imagine that it's stimulated by, let's say, exposure to sunlight. And if you remember from last semester from the skin, uh, increased density and increased quantity of melanin in the skin is protecting the skin from the bad effects of UV light from the sun. But at the same time, it's shielding the cells underneath it from the sun, which reduces the amount of vitamin D that the skin can produce. So it's a trade-off. Either you protect yourself from the sun more, or you produce more vitamin D. You can't have it both ways. It's hard to find that kind of Goldilocks solution. Not too hot, not too cold, just right protection, just right vitamin D. Uh, Posterior pituitary. Posterior pituitary is completely different. If you look under the microscope, it looks very, very different. Why? Because it's a very different embryonic origin. Anterior pituitary is an outgrowth from the roof of the mouth. It grows up, while posterior pituitary is nervous tissue. It's an outgrowth of the hypothalamus growing down, and then the two meet and kind of glue itself to each other. Uh, Posterior pituitary secretes two hormones. However, those two hormones are not synthesized in the posterior pituitary. They're synthesized in the hypothalamus and then transferred various tubes uh, to the posterior pituitary, where they're stored until there's a stimulus to release them. Those two hormones are oxytocin and vasopressin. Vasopressin is also called ADH, or diuretic hormone, because one of its most important physiological um, function is the control of water release from the kidney, how much water goes into the urine and how much water goes back into the bloodstream. We're going to talk about the role of ADH in the kidney in greater detail once we cover the kidney. Uh, ADH, or vasopressin, also has behavioral effects. There have been some very interesting studies in voles. There are two species of voles living, both of them in North Carolina, montane vole and vole. One of those species is gregarious, and everybody mates with everybody. It's like most mammals do, right? They go around, find a mate, move on, find another mate. There's a lot of mixing. So it's a polygamous society, like most mammals are. Uh, but the other species is very, very monogamous. They make a pair and they're loyal to each other, and don't stray out unless one partner is killed or something like that. Then you can go find another one. So they're very monogamous, and they're almost indistinguishable when you look at them from the outside. The genetics genomes are very, very similar. Their anatomy is similar. Everything is very, very similar. They just live in the Piedmont versus the mountains, and have very, very different behavior, social and sexual behavior. And so what was discovered was that the pattern of expression of vasopressin receptors in different parts of the brain is different between those two species. And then, about a decade ago or something like that, with some new molecular techniques, they managed to replicate the pattern of one species in the brains of the other, and vice versa. And it's changed the behavior. The polygamous ones became monogamous, the monogamous ones became polygamous. The only difference now is the pattern of exactly where vasopressin receptors were in the brain. So, which parts of the brain were stimulated by vasopressin and which ones were not. So vasopressin has something to say about the social and sexual structure of a species. Oxytocin is the other hormone of the posterior pituitary, and we already talked about it in a couple of videos ago when I was talking about positive feedback loops, because oxytocin is involved in a couple of them. The in the triggering of the contractions of the uterus, and in the triggering of ejection of milk during nursing. Both of those are examples of positive feedback loops. So I mentioned oxytocin quite a lot. At the time, I also mentioned that oxytocin also has behavioral effects. When you are flooded with oxytocin, you're calm and you like the person you're with, be it your baby, your mom, your sexual partner, your group that you're all hugging and singing together and whatnot, which is an in-group, out-group, because more you like people close to you, less you like and more suspicious you are of people you don't know. So you go to some kind of a meeting where everybody's hugging and loving and singing together and boosting each other's oxytocin. Then you walk out in the street and you're suspicious of strangers. Okay, that is the posterior pituitary. Let's go down to thymus. Thymus is an interesting gland. I don't think there's anybody in our class who is younger than 18, which means nobody in our class has thymus right now. Thymus is a gland that secretes thymosin, and thymosin is a really important hormone in the development of the immune system. Once the immune system is fully developed, thymosin is not necessary, so thymus is not necessary, and it shrinks and shrivels, and there's nothing left. Uh, and while it's there in the young, it's on top of the heart, kind of hugging the heart from the top, and then it shrinks and shrivels and disappears. The T cells of the immune system are those that have matured inside of the thymus. Once you're about 18, that process is over. Your immune system is now mature, and you don't need thymus anymore. Thyroid. Thyroid gland, roughly here in the throat, kind of attached to the trachea and esophagus behind it. There's two of them, one on each side. And the most important thing is that it secretes the two hormones, the thyroxine and triiodothyronine. Thyroxine is also 4-iodothyronine. So those two hormones are modifications of thyronine, which is an amino acid. It is a non-polar molecule, which means it acts via nuclear receptors. And remember, for the thyroid, nuclear receptors are already attached to the DNA, and once the thyroid hormone attaches to its receptor, the complex changes its shape and thus its energy and starts transcribing those genes. What do thyroid hormones do? They are involved in several different aspects of energetics. And the most important in birds and mammals is the control of body temperature. Body temperature is controlled how? Okay, so you all remember, that the source of energy for everything is glucose. So you are eating food, and all sorts of other things get transformed into glucose in order for the cells to be able to utilize glucose as a source of energy. The glycolysis, which is the first few steps of breakdown of glucose happen in the cytoplasm, and then the whole process moves inside of the mitochondria, where it enters the second stage, which is the Krebs cycle, um, and then ends up with all that electron transfer until what you end up with are water, carbon dioxide, and all that energy bound in the three phosphate groups of the ATP molecule, adenosine triphosphate. So much of that work of the breakdown of glucose molecules is happening inside of mitochondria. So you can think of mitochondria as an engine where you put in gasoline, that's glucose, and the engine breaks down the bonds of that molecule, just like your car engine breaks down the molecules of gasoline to produce energy to turn the wheels. Uh, your mitochondria are breaking down bonds in the glucose molecule to produce energy that is going to be bound into the phosphate bonds of ATP, which then can be used by any other biochemical reaction in the body that requires energy. Well, breakdown of gasoline in the engine, you know that it's not perfect. It's not all going into the turning of wheels. Once you turn on the engine and your engine starts breaking down the chemical bonds of gasoline, some of that energy is going to be turned into heat instead. No motor, no engine is 100% efficient, which means it's impossible to turn every breakdown of every chemical bond into what you want. It's 60% efficiency is great. Anything higher than that is fantastic. Well, mitochondria is an engine of sorts. It breaks down the glucose molecules to build ATP. It's not going to be a perfect engine. It's not going to have a perfect efficiency. There is going to be proportion of glucose molecules that are not going to be broken down correctly. Remember, at microscopic stage, uh, a microscopic scale, a lot of this is just molecules bumping into each other randomly, and statistics tells you that most of the molecules are going to respond in a certain react in a certain ways, but not all. Some of them are going to miss, and so some of the bonds in glucose are not going to be broken correctly, and as a result, you get things like hydrogen peroxide instead of water and carbon dioxide. Hydrogen peroxide is one of those free radicals, and it's going to be destructive uh, against the cell. It's going to react with whatever first it attaches and breaks it down. So we have evolved uh, uh, enzymes that are really really good at scavenging those free radicals and neutralizing them. Uh, some of the vitamins, like vitamin E and vitamin C, are really good at uh, kind of hunting down and neutralizing free radicals. Hormone melatonin is the most potent anti-radical, anti-free radical compound, and we naturally produce it every night, which is why sleep is good for you, because we are producing melatonin only at night when you sleep, especially if we sleep in a dark room. Um, so a proportion of glucose bonds are not broken down properly, which means that energy, instead of being bound into ATP, gets released as heat. That happens in fish and reptiles too, but in birds and mammals, uh, that process is controlled. There are actually pores on the surface of the membrane. Remember how mitochondria has an outer membrane and an inner membrane, and inner membrane has all these kind of folds. Well, the outer membrane has pores, and those pores, the opening and closing of these pores, is controlled by thyroid hormones. So when you open up the pores, you reduce the efficiency of the glucose breakdown, which means more of the energy gets lost as heat, which means it increases the heat of that cell, increases the heat of the body. So, thyroid hormone opens up those pores, makes it more efficient, raises body temperature. If you go to the doctor, there are all sorts of things that can give you fever. But if you go to the doctor and your body temperature is lower than normal, the first test is a thyroid test. Maybe something's wrong with thyroid signaling, because all those pores are closed, and so you're not converting sufficient number of glucose molecules into heat. Okay, parathyroid. While we're at thyroid and parathyroid, thyroid and parathyroid hormones, both of those glands secrete also hormones that are involved in calcium homeostasis, controlling the levels of calcium in all the body fluids, in the blood, extracellular fluids, and all that stuff. Calcitonin is secreted by the thyroid, parathormone by parathyroid gland. Those two hormones are antagonists. Now, remember, antagonists are the two hormones that have opposite effects and often also can directly inhibit each other. So, calcitonin is going to try to inhibit parathormone. Parathormone is going to try to inhibit calcitonin. As a result, you always have a balance, which is why you have a pretty level uh, concentrations of calcium over time. Uh, Opposite of antagonist is agonistic. If they, both have the same, let's say, if two hormones have exactly the same function, you have a little bit of one, you have a little bit of the other. Those things are additive. You're adding something and you're adding some more of that, and you add those two up. All the two hormones have done the job. You only have the additive, which is different from synergistic. If you have two hormones that have the same function, but if both of them are working at the same time, they're going to potentiate each other's effect. So it's not just adding the effects of one hormone and adding to the effects of the other hormone, and what is the sum? That's what you get. You have to multiply. They are actually going to potentiate each other's effects. So that is synergistic. So agonistic, antagonistic, synergistic. Permissive is if you have one hormone being able to have its function only in the presence of another hormone. One hormone primes the cell uh, to have that function. It has to be simultaneous. So, for instance, you have to have progesterone present in order for estrogen to do a particular function, and it has to be right there at the same time, which is different from organizing and activating effects of hormones, where organizing happens at what point in life, usually early embryo, and the activating happens years later because the cell was prepared. So they don't have to be simultaneous. With permissive, they have to be simultaneous. So calcium is one of those things where there is no rheostasis. I forgot last time to show you. Actually, have the book rheostasis. If you can see it, is it? I hope. Well, it's probably a mirror image, but you can see it, and you see the picture in your handout. So it's one of those rare things that doesn't show rheostasis, where it's only homeostasis when you actually have one level of calcium that is constant throughout life, because that level is necessary for the proper function of the nervous system, cardiovascular system, and muscular system. Uh, how do you remember which one raises and which one lowers calcium? Calcitonin. Calcitones it down. Parathormone is going to go to the opposite, is going to raise calcium. How do they do it? Parathormone we are going to mention several times because it does it in several different places in several different ways. In order to raise the blood calcium, parathormone is going to take calcium out of bones and teeth. It is going to take it out of urine. A certain amount of calcium is going to go out in urine, and in the kidney, calcitonin is going to take more of that calcium back out of the urine and back into the bloodstream. Uh, uh, paired hormone is going to stimulate greater absorption of calcium from food in the intestine. So there's several different places where paired hormone acts in order to raise calcium levels. Uh, Calcitonin tones it down. So it does everything opposite. It lowers the absorption of calcium from food. It lowers, uh, or doesn't do anything, just doesn't, just counters parent hormones. So less calcium is returned from the urine to the blood. It deposits calcium and phosphorus into the teeth and bones. So calcitonin and paired hormone are antagonists. Okay, which brings me to pancreas. Pancreas is both an endocrine and exocrine gland. We're going to talk about the exocrine stuff later. Endocrine. Um, it produces four or five hormones, but we're going to focus on the two main ones, which are insulin and glucagon. Those two hormones are secreted from uh, alpha and beta cells. Beta cells secrete insulin, alpha cells secrete glucagon. Those cells are located in tiny, tiny little groups of cells, which are called islets of Langerhans. I hate how the textbooks these days are eliminating the names of founders and discoverers of all these things in order to eliminate the history. So it's like written stone. These are, pancreatic islets. No, the islets of Langerhans, and read a little bit about Langerhans. He's an interesting guy, and you figure out how he figured it out. So you learn a little bit about how we learn about the body because of how different people in history have learned about the body by being very, very clever and not having the modern laboratory techniques at their disposal. So islets of Langerhans are little islets of cells all over the pancreas, and they have alpha, beta, gamma cells right next to each other. Alpha cells glucagon, beta cells insulin. They are right next to each other. And they can, in a paracrine way, inhibit each other, constantly trying to inhibit each other. Uh, which is kind of important because they're controlling glucose levels, which have to be pretty balanced too. There is a little bit of rheostasis of glucose, not that much. So those are two antagonists. Insulin puts glucose into the cells. Glucagon takes glucose out of the cells, puts them in the bloodstream, takes them wherever the energy is needed. So insulin stores glucose for later use, and glucagon takes the glucose out when there's an energetic need for glucose to be taken to, let's say, muscles to produce ATP for muscle contraction. So those are also antagonists. And just like they're antagonizing each other by having the opposite function, they're also antagonizing each other by directly inhibiting each other. And it's very, very easy when the cells are next to each other. They can just inhibit, the cells can inhibit the neighboring cells. Okay, the next one, adrenal. Adrenal cortex and adrenal medulla. Remember the anterior and posterior pituitary, how they look very, very different under the microscope because they're embryologically very different, one being nervous tissue coming from the hypothalamus and the other being very glandular tissue coming from the roof of the mouth. The same system, the same thing is happening in the adrenal gland. The adrenal medulla is an outgrowth of the spinal cord, essentially. It's nervous tissue, and under the microscope, it looks like nervous tissue. The cortex around it looks very much like a glandular tissue, lots of round cells full of juice, and and they are completely different in mesodermal origin. So those two just happen to be one inside of the other. Medulla secretes epinephrine and norepinephrine, which you can also call adrenaline and noradrenaline, which is the fast-acting uh, amine, fast acting amine in the stress response. Uh, Cortex has actually three different layers of cells, which you need to know and recognize on the slides for the lab. For the lecture, you don't need to know that. And those three layers are secreting different kinds of hormones. One of the layers secretes aldosterone. aldosterone is a molecule that acts on the collecting tubules of the nephron in the kidney, again controlling water retention, how much water goes out into the outside world by urine, and how much is retained inside of back placed back into the circulation. The next hormone in the adrenal cortex is uh, cortisol, another stress hormone. It's a little slower, right? It's a steroid. So, polar amine epinephrine is going to have a very fast and very short lived effect using, remember, the G protein receptors. And cortisol is a steroid. So it takes some time. It enters the cell and then, triggers on the, uh, transcription of various RNAs and making proteins and whatnot. So it's a slower stress response, and it also is part of the stress response, which is taking the energy. Right? It's mobilizing the energy stores for running away from danger or something like that. The third layer of the inner layer of the adrenal cortex secretes small quantities of sex steroids. Those are estrogens and androgens, testosterone. It's happening in both men and women. Uh, if that part of the adrenal is overdoing it, you'll have more, let's say, androgens in the circulation in a woman, which can lead to some masculinization of some features, like growing of a beard, which I'm here having right now because I didn't shave because we're working from home, so I shave. Uh, and so let's say growing beards in women is an indicator that maybe your adrenal cortex is overactive, which could be due to a tumor of some sort. This is something that needs to be investigated. Okay, gonads, ovary, and testes are also sources of hormones: testosterone in the testes, estrogen and progesterone in the ovary. Much more important in the reproductive system than right here. Testosterone has effects on maturation of sperm, has effects on development of primary and secondary sexual conditions, has behavioral effects, not so much aggression as people say. I've posted some links in additional readings about it, especially the video by Sapolsky about stress. So you're going to learn a little bit more about that when you do a reproductive system. The same thing with the ovary. Estrogen has several different functions, not just development of primary and secondary sexual characteristics and behavioral, but also for ovulation. That's the main hormone for ovulation, and it's involved in another positive feedback loop that I didn't describe in detail because you have to learn it from the book. Because ovulation is a positive feedback loop. Once there is um, uh, ovulation, so the egg escapes the follicle and goes into the oviduct and maybe gets fertilized and starts the embryonic development. That follicle turns into yellow body. That yellow body starts secreting progesterone. Progesterone is going to protect the wall of the uterus so the embryo can implant, and preventing it from being sloughed off in the next menstrual cycle. If there is uh, no embryo, the over is going to get a signal that it is not necessary to keep the yellow body anymore. There's no need for progesterone, and so the yellow body shrinks, becomes white body. Um, and again, this is something you should learn more from your reproductive chapter than your endocrine chapter. Uh, Pineal gland and melatonin. Okay, pineal gland and melatonin. Melatonin is secreted actually in a number of different places. Melatonin is secreted in the retina of the eye. Usually does not escape into the circulation, but it definitely has function within the retina. Large quantities of melatonin are secreted in the intestine. Again, most of it does not escape into the circulation. It has local effects in the uh, in the intestine itself. Depends on the dose. Either inhibits at lower dose or stimulates at higher dose the movement of the intestines. Why is melatonin everywhere? Because it's a byproduct or metabolite of serotonin, and serotonin is a neurotransmitter that acts in various different places in the nervous system. And you remember the gastrointestinal system has its own kind of nervous system, which is relatively independent from the rest of it, and serotonin is a major neurotransmitter there. So you start with tryptophan, a couple of enzymatic reactions, you get serotonin, another one or two enzymatic reactions, and you have melatonin. It's a very simple, straightforward metabolic pathway that goes from an amino acid through serotonin to melatonin. So it's not surprising that melatonin is everywhere where serotonin is. Pineal gland is one of those places. Now, pineal gland in us, in mammals, is unusual because it is deep inside of the brain and it cannot sense light on its own. And all the other vertebrates, except snakes, are the same way. In all the other vertebrates, the pineal gland is right there on the top. And sometimes even the bone is thinner and transparent right on top of it in order for the light to be able to reach. So the pineal gland in all the other vertebrates actually directly senses light. And every time it senses light, that is inhibiting production of melatonin. Every time it senses darkness, that's a stimulus to produce melatonin. Now, in mammals, including us, the pineal cannot see, and the pineal is deep inside of our brains, which means it has to get the information about the ambient light in another way. It gets it from through the retina, but it doesn't get it from rods and cones. It gets it from a small subset of retinal ganglion cells that are directly photosensitive. They have another opsin, another different type of photopigment called melanopsin. And there's only about 1,000 ganglion cells that have melanopsin in the left eye and 1,000 in the right eye. And the axons of those ganglion cells are going to three different places in the brain. One is for the pupillary reflex. So, because those ganglion cells are essentially light meters, they're not forming image. They're just measuring the intensity and spectrum of light. And so, if there's a high light, you need to close your pupils, right? So, some of those axons go to the center for pupillary reflex. Some go to the center for mood. Constant light as well as constant darkness can make you depressed. And a regular alteration of alternation of light and darkness are healthy for you, which is why you get depressed in jail or if you're in a cave for many, many days. And the third place, and most important place, where those retinal ganglion cells project their axons is the suprachiasmatic nucleus in the hypothalamus, which is the pacemaker of the circadian system, the main clock that drives all the other clocks in all the other cells in the body. And remember, we have a clock in every cell of our body. Even RBCs that don't have a nucleus have circadian rhythms in them. So it's the main pacemaker. There is a very important tract of nerves going from the suprachiasmatic nucleus to the pineal. It is using noradrenaline norepinephrine uh, as its neurotransmitter, and it tells the pineal when it's light to stop production of melatonin. And when it stops, it's dark and it can trigger the secretion of melatonin. So, melatonin is very much tied to the light in the ambient, in the outside world. Uh, Melatonin has a lot of other subtle functions. I already mentioned that it's the best molecule for scavenging free radicals, so you want you a dose of melatonin every night. It has a slight uh, inhibitory effect on the reproductive system, which has to do a little bit with seasonality. Even humans have some seasonality in reproduction. Um, there, if you are, let's say, on Facebook and you get, Facebook notifications who has the birthday today, especially if you have lots and lots of friends, so you get a few every day, you're going to see that there are seasons or parts of the year where, you get one, two, three friends have birthday, and then you get into parts of the year where every day it seems like there's 12 or 15 or 20 of them have birthdays. So there's a little bit of a seasonality, and it's related to the latitude on the Earth, even in humans, and it's definitely in all the other animals who are seasonally reproducing. Most animals reproduce in spring, some in fall, like deer, and it's the duration of the signal of the melatonin that tells the animal how long is the night, which tells it how long is the day, how long is the photo period, which tells it what time of year it is, and so it triggers or inhibits reproduction. Melatonin is a non-polar uh, molecule, derivative of tryptophan, so derivative of an amino acid. Your book is wrong telling you uh, that epinephrine is the only one, um, or that the thyroid is the only non-polar. Melatonin is non-polar, so it acts via nuclear receptors or cytoplasmic receptors because it easily enters the cell, and it works the same way, uh, attaching to the genome and turning on various genes. Those effects are usually there's a different pathway coming from the light that has the off switch for the effect. Uh, there are membrane receptors for melatonin. We don't have them, but some other organisms have them, and it's important for our health because Plasmodium falciparum, that's the protist that causes malaria, has surface membrane melatonin receptors, and it's very very important because they have no idea when the light is, and the thing is they live inside of our red blood cells, but it's not really good for them to go out of the red blood cell one at a time or burst one red blood cell open and a thousand of them goes out because our immune systems are going to kill them. They need to overwhelm our immune system by having millions of them emerge out of red blood cells simultaneously. So how they're going to synchronize with each other? They can't talk to each other. Well, they're all synchronized to us as a host, and what they tune into is, well, what is the hormone of timing? Time of day, it's the molecule melatonin. And so they have surface membrane melatonin receptors. And when all those plasmodiums get hit by melatonin all at the same time, right? Because we just went to sleep and our melatonin is hitting our cardiovascular system, they're going to sense it and they're going to go on an attack, break out and destroy the red blood cells and go out into the circulation by billions, totally overwhelming our immune system to quickly scavenge them, which means they are now in circulation. What is the time of night? It's early night. Without mosquitoes, and mosquitoes are going to bite us right at that time. We're also attracting them by carbon dioxide, which we're breathing out. And so they bite us and they take in the blood, which now has not just red blood cells that have in them plasmodium, but a lot of free swimming plasmodia. And then they go to the neighbor, bite the neighbor, and those plasmodia are now free in the new host. They can go into the red blood cells, multiply, and wait once there's enough of them at a certain developmental stage. They wait for a melatonin signal, which they're going to detect by their membrane bound melatonin receptors, to burst open again. Okay, I'm going to stop here, and next time we might talk a little bit about reproductive system. Thank you.